We're going to be looking at how to create box joints on pieces of material, specifically for this jewelry box project that we're going to be making. So we're going to be doing these finger or box joints on each of the corners of our project. Now this is the jig here that we will be using, and the jig has this part that sits on the table with the router bit in the middle. And if you take a look, we are using a straight or a spiral cut here, straight cutter for our material. Today we're going to be focusing on a 1/4 inch box joint. So we're going to take our jig and set it right over so the bit is protruding out of that hole, and I'm going to set this into these little metal pieces into the miter track of the machine. This fence portion will sit on here and help support our material, but we don't need that quite yet. What we need to do is get some parameters set up for this jig. So we're going to take our material, and your material needs to be processed down to a 1/2 inch. For this purpose of the class, we're expecting everybody to have their material at a 1/2 inch, just to make things for the setting up nice and easy. What we want you to do is verify that it's a 1/2 inch by measuring with the caliper. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take the thickness of one of our boards and put it up here against the fence. So when our wood is on the table, the bit should be sticking up and our wood should be just lower than the bit. The bit should be higher than our material just slightly. And the reason for that is when we're done building our project, we don't want to have the chance of these fingers being too short. We want them to be just a little bit longer than the piece of wood here. That way we don't have a recessed piece that we have to sand. We would rather have these little tongues sticking out and have to sand them down than have the whole side be too thin and have to sand the whole piece of material. So that's why we want our workpiece to be just slightly below the surface or the edge of the cutter. And so we would adjust that underneath the router table by twisting the collar up to get that bit nice and flush. So as I've got my hand under the router table on the motor, I have it loose so I can raise and lower the bit. And I want the bit just slightly, not too much. We don't want it too much hanging off or it's going to change the size of our project. But we do want just a little bit strong with that bit. We want a little bit higher up. Once you have that set, then go ahead and lock the motor back into place underneath the machine, and then verify after it's locked that that amount above the workpiece is still where you want it to be. I'm going to take this shim and now set the distance between this guide and that bit. And so the first thing I'm going to do, and you could use any shim that's a 1/4 inch. It doesn't have to be a fancy shim like this. It could be a piece of wood or anything that's a 1/4 inch. And what we're going to do is I'm going to get this somewhat lined up center in that hole, and I'm going to tighten down one of the handles. Now I can still position this by moving one side to get this where I want it. And so I'm going to take my little feeler gauge and I'm going to set that in there right next to the bit so that I can get a good fit between the bit and that piece. Now I'm going to rotate the bit around a little bit. I got my hand on the collet down here, and I'm going to make sure that as I rotate that I am not catching the metal of my shim. I want it to be a nice good fit. And so again, I'm still movable. I can move this and get some different sizes here. So I'm going to keep my joint or my bit nice and tight against my feeler gauge, which is tight against my shim or my track here. And once I'm happy with where that's located, I'm going to keep some pressure on there so that it doesn't move, and I'm going to tighten up this other locking handle here and get that snugged down. Now, just like anything else, when we're in the wood shop, we should run a test piece and make sure it's set for what we need. So we're going to run a test piece up here, and before we run our test pieces, we're going to talk about how to run our pieces. So we're going to hold the workpiece flat against the jig here, and we're going to need to run it through. So in order to help keep this at 90 degrees, we're going to use this little fence behind here, and it's going to help support the material. Now, just like any other machine, we don't want to go past the blade and then come back over the blade. We just want to go one time or in one direction over the blade. So we're going to run our piece through, and then we'll move it around, come back, and set it on there. Our first pass is butt up tight against this stop. Then the next pass, it's going to sit on top of there. And then the next pass, it's just going to keep moving over and over and over. So let's take a look at running this end. All right, so we have all of our pieces cut, and this was my original starting side. I need to pay attention to that because I need to keep that as my starting side as I flip this board over and run the other side. Now for this test piece, we're not going to flip it over, but I do need to still know which side I started on. So I'm going to take this side I started on and now turn it around and put this notch on the track. Now that's going to give me the correct spacing for my next piece of wood. My next piece of wood then is going to butt up nice and even to that, and that is going to be the correct spacing for that first notch on the second piece. After I run that first notch, I can then move this out of the way, and then I just do as normal and just step over that track. So let's take a look here. I'm going to take the two pieces I just cut and we're going to fit them together. Now we want a nice tight fit. These should go in pretty easily. If they're too tight, what's going to happen is we're going to push all the glue out and we won't have much surface area for glue inside the joint. We don't want to do that. Now you can see what I mean by having these just a little bit long. That allows us to sand off those extra tongues off each side. Now, if they were a little short, when we put this together, we would have a recess down in here like this if my blade wasn't high enough. And then that would mean we'd have to sand this whole surface all the way down to get this even. So we don't want those fingers sunk in like that. We want them sticking out. So the blade height looks pretty good. We might make just a little bit of adjustment, and most of our adjustment is either going to be the blade height, and that's how much tongue is sticking out or is not sticking out, or how tight the joint is. Now we can't change how much material is removed. How much material is removed is set by the thickness of the bit. What we're changing is the amount of material left over. So when this is in my jig here, what we're changing is the distance between this track and the bit. And so if it's too tight, then maybe we move it closer, and it's going to make these little fingers thinner so that they fit together a little easier. We don't want them sloppy. We don't want any movement up and down vertically in there, but we don't want them so tight that we have to use a mallet to pull them together or push them together. So if you feel that it needs to be adjusted, you would just repeat the process, making sure that the blade height is set right, making sure your distance here is at 1/4 inch, and if it's not, you're going to make your little tweaks back and forth until you get it right where you want it. Again, always running a test piece before you run this on your good pieces. So we've made some adjustments. We're now going to run our pieces again as a test piece to make sure we get a nice tight fit. All right, so after we ran some new test pieces, because we made the adjustment, we're going to fit them together. They slide together really nice. They're not too tight. And my pieces are hanging off just slightly. That gives me some room to sand. That might be a little strong. We could go a little less on our height when we run our good pieces. So that looks good. They fit together nice. My top is nice and tight. All that looks good. My joint's nice and flush on the bottom and on the top. So that all matches up really nice. So now we're going to get ready to do our good pieces.